Jimi Hendrix wrote a song so controversial that radio stations refused to play it. But it wasn't about drugs, sex, or politics. It was about a single word that people in 1967 thought was too offensive to broadcast. This is the story of censorship and prejudice. It was May 1967, and Jimi Hendrix was at the peak of his early success in England. His first album, Are You Experienced?, was climbing the charts. The British music press was calling him a genius. Teenagers were lining up around the block to see him play. He'd accomplished in 6 months what most musicians couldn't achieve in a lifetime. But then the BBC called. They wanted to talk about track 7 on his album, a psychedelic instrumental piece called Third Stone from the Sun. There was a problem, they said. A serious problem. The song couldn't be played on BBC radio in its current form. Jimi's manager, Chaz Chandler, took the call first. When he hung up, he looked confused and slightly amused. "They want to ban Third Stone," he told Jimi. Jimi was in the studio working on his second album. He put down his guitar and walked over. "Ban it? Why? There aren't even real lyrics. It's mostly instrumental." "Apparently there's a word in the spoken section they find offensive," Chandler explained. The spoken section Chandler referred to was a brief narrative in the middle of the song where Jimi's voice, run through heavy effects to sound alien and otherworldly, delivered a short monologue. The lyrics went, "Strange, beautiful grass of green, with your majestic silver seas, your mysterious mountains I wish to see closer. May I land my kinky machine?" It was trippy, surreal, deliberately weird, classic Jimi. But the BBC wasn't concerned about kinky machine or any other phrase that might seem sexual. The problem, they said, was earlier in the song. In another section, Jimi's processed voice said, "You'll never hear surf music again." That wasn't the issue either.
The problem was a single word that appeared nowhere in the song as it was released, but in some early promotional materials and in the original liner notes, the song had been described as being influenced by gypsy music or having a gypsy feel to certain instrumental passages. The word was gypsy, and in 1967 Britain, that word was considered by some to be offensive to the Romani people. When Jimi heard this, he laughed. "They're banning my song because I mentioned gypsy music? Are you serious?" But the BBC was very serious. In the 1960s, the corporation had strict guidelines about language that could be considered derogatory to any ethnic or cultural group. The term gypsy, they argued, was a slur used against Romani people. The proper term was Romani or traveler. Using gypsy in song titles or descriptions, they said, perpetuated stereotypes and discrimination. Jimi was baffled. "I wasn't making fun of anybody," he said. "I was paying tribute to the music. Gypsy jazz, Django Reinhardt, that whole tradition, it influenced that song. How was that offensive?" But the BBC's position was firm. Either remove any reference to gypsy from the promotional materials and never use the term in interviews about the song, or they wouldn't play it. And if the BBC wouldn't play it, many other radio stations would follow their lead. Chaz Chandler, ever the pragmatist, suggested they just comply. "It's one word in the liner notes, Jimi. We can change it. No big deal." But Jimi saw it differently. "It's not about one word," he said. "It's about who gets to decide what words mean and how they're used. I didn't use gypsy as an insult. I used it because that's what the music is called. That's what Django called it. That's what Charlie Christian called it."
This kicked off a debate that went far beyond one song on one album. It touched on questions that are still relevant today. Who decides what language is offensive? Can a word be reclaimed or used respectfully? Does context matter? And who gets to make these decisions? The artists, the corporations, or the communities potentially affected? Jimi decided to dig deeper into the issue. He started asking musicians from the Romani community what they thought. Did they find the term gypsy music offensive when used to describe a musical genre? The responses he got were mixed. Some Romani musicians said yes, the term had been used pejoratively for so long that any use of it perpetuated harm. Others said that in a musical context, especially when referring to the Django Reinhardt tradition, it wasn't offensive, it was descriptive. The music had been called gypsy jazz for decades, named partially by Romani musicians themselves. But there was a complicating factor. The BBC wasn't just concerned about the word gypsy in a musical context. They were dealing with broader social issues in Britain at the time. Romani and Irish traveler communities faced severe discrimination in 1960s Britain. They were denied housing, refused service at shops and pubs, and subjected to prejudice that was both casual and systematic. In this environment, the BBC was trying to be careful about any language that might reinforce stereotypes. Their hearts were arguably in the right place, even if their approach seemed heavy-handed to Jimi. The controversy came to a head during a radio interview in June 1967. The host asked Jimi about the BBC's decision not to play Third Stone from the Sun. Jimi's response was measured but firm. "I understand wanting to be respectful. I never want to hurt anybody with my music, but I also don't think you fight prejudice by pretending cultures don't exist or by erasing the names of musical traditions. Django Reinhardt was Romani, and he played gypsy jazz. That's not a slur. That's history. That's music." The host pressed him. "But if the BBC says the term is offensive, shouldn't you respect that?"
Respect it? Sure, Jimi said. Agree with it. That's different. I think when you ban words without looking at context, without asking the people supposedly being protected what they actually think, you're not fighting prejudice, you're just performing a different kind of control. This was surprisingly political for Jimi, who usually avoided controversial statements in interviews, but the issue had struck a nerve. As a Black American who'd faced racism his entire life, he understood the power of language to hurt, but he also understood that intention mattered, that context mattered, and that blanket bans often did more to make institutions feel good about themselves than to actually help marginalized communities. The BBC didn't change their position. Third Stone from the Sun remained off their playlist. Some other British radio stations followed suit. But interestingly, pirate radio stations, unlicensed broadcasters operating from ships off the British coast, played the song constantly, partially because the BBC had banned it. Jimi refused to change the liner notes or stop using the term gypsy jazz when describing his influences. "I'm not going to lie about where the music comes from," he told his record label. "If that means some stations won't play it, that's their choice. But I'm not going to pretend Django Reinhardt didn't exist or that his tradition doesn't matter." The ban had an unintended consequence. It made Third Stone from the Sun more popular. Fans sought out the album specifically to hear the banned song. Music journalists wrote articles about censorship and artistic freedom. The controversy kept Jimi's name in the papers even more than usual. But beyond the publicity, the incident revealed deeper tensions in how societies deal with language, culture, and defense. The BBC was trying to protect a marginalized community, which was admirable. But they'd made that decision without meaningfully consulting that community. They'd assumed that any use of the term gypsy was harmful, without considering context or intent. Jimi started incorporating more obviously Romani-influenced guitar work into his live performances, partly as a quiet form of protest. During concerts, he'd play extended versions of Third Stone from the Sun and then launch into Django Reinhardt-style jazz passages, making the influence undeniable and impossible to ignore. At one concert in London, he dedicated a performance to Django Reinhardt and all the gypsy jazz musicians who created some of the most beautiful music ever played. The audience cheered. Some critics accused him of being provocative for the sake of it, but Jimi maintained he was simply honoring his influences. The story took an interesting turn when actual Romani musicians started speaking up in Jimi's defense. Several British Romani jazz musicians wrote to the BBC saying they weren't offended by Jimi's use of the term in a musical context. They argued that gypsy jazz was the recognized name of a musical genre.
that trying to erase that name erased their contribution to music history. But the BBC didn't reverse their decision. In the bureaucratic logic of large institutions, once a policy is set, changing it would mean admitting the original decision was wrong. So the ban stayed in place, even as the rationale for it became increasingly questionable. For Jimi, the whole experience was educational, but frustrating. He'd come to England partially to escape the racial dynamics of America, where he'd faced constant discrimination. Britain had seemed more open, more accepting, but this incident showed him that prejudice and overcorrection were just different faces of the same problem. People in power making decisions about marginalized communities without actually listening to those communities. In interviews over the following months, Jimi returned to this theme occasionally. "You can't fight hate by banning words," he said in one interview. "You fight it by listening to people, by respecting people, by making space for everyone's voice. When you just ban stuff without understanding it, you're still doing a kind of violence, just a quieter kind." This was remarkably insightful for a 24-year-old guitarist who'd been famous for less than a year. But Jimi had lived through enough real discrimination to understand the difference between genuine prejudice and performative political correctness. The BBC ban on Third Stone from the Sun stayed in place until 1969, when the corporation quietly changed its policy. By then, Jimi had moved on to other battles, other songs, other controversies. But the incident remains significant in music history as an example of how censorship, even well-intentioned censorship, can miss the point. Decades later, music historians and cultural critics would look back at this incident as a case study in the complexity of language politics. The BBC had wanted to protect Romani people from a potentially derogatory term. That impulse was good, but they'd implemented it in a way that actually erased Romani contributions to music history and ignored what actual Romani musicians thought about the issue.
Jimi Hendrix, meanwhile, had taken a stand that was both simple and profound. Respect communities by listening to them, not by making decisions for them. Honor cultural traditions by acknowledging them, not by pretending they don't exist. Fight prejudice with understanding, not with blanket bans. Today, Third Stone from the Sun is recognized as one of Jimi's most innovative compositions. Music scholars analyze its structure, its use of feedback, its psychedelic production. The gypsy jazz influences that Jimi incorporated, the chromatic runs, the use of diminished chords, the improvisational spirit, are celebrated as part of what makes the song brilliant. And the word that caused so much controversy? It's still complicated. The debate about whether gypsy is an acceptable term in musical contexts continues. Some prefer Romani jazz. Others argue that gypsy jazz is the historical name of a specific tradition, and changing it erases history. But everyone agrees on one thing. The decision should be made by Romani communities themselves, not by corporations or institutions acting on their behalf, which is exactly what Jimi argued in 1967. The incident also revealed something about Jimi's character that often gets lost in the legend of the wild guitar god. He was thoughtful. He cared about cultural respect and historical accuracy. He was willing to stand up to powerful institutions when he thought they were wrong, even if it cost him radio play. In the end, the BBC ban probably hurt the BBC's credibility more than it hurt Jimi's career. The song became a fan favorite anyway. Pirate radio made sure people heard it. And the controversy itself became part of the song's legend. But the real legacy of the incident is the questions it raised. Questions we're still grappling with today. How do we honor cultural traditions while being respectful of the communities that created them? How do we fight prejudice without erasing history? Who gets to decide what language is acceptable? Jimi didn't have all the answers,
but he asked the right questions, and he refused to let institutions make those decisions in isolation without consulting the communities actually affected. In a 1968 interview, a year after the controversy, someone asked Jimi if he regretted not complying with the BBC's request. He smiled that enigmatic smile and said, "The only thing I regret is that more people didn't get to hear the song on the radio. But I don't regret standing up for Django's legacy. I don't regret asking who decides. I don't regret insisting that if you're going to protect people, you should probably ask them what they actually want protected." Then he picked up his guitar and played a Django Reinhardt riff, perfectly executed, a tribute to the tradition that had influenced him and that no amount of corporate censorship could erase from his music or his memory. If this story of censorship and artistic integrity moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to understand that fighting prejudice means listening to people, not speaking for them. Have you ever been censored for the wrong reasons? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like this video for more untold stories from music's greatest legends.